a reckless heir, a desperate assistant, a mother who won't let go. He had everything: money, power, freedom, but one woman dared to challenge him. She entered his life as an employee and left as his greatest regret. But some battles aren't over until the last move is made, and this game is far from finished. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Today, we'll be discussing a captivating new Nigerian movie that offers more than just entertainment. It's packed with valuable lessons you won't want to miss. So, let's dive in. The movie begins with a young man named Richard, who comes to the dining table and calls for his maid. When she arrives, he slaps her harshly for a trivial reason. His mother then enters, and upon hearing that the maid hasn't prepared food for her son, becomes furious. She punishes the maid, hitting her for not being attentive enough, then fires her. Afterward, she comforts her son with a massage before going to oversee the maid's actions. The next day at the office, Mrs. Emo informs Kaimara about her promotion to the position of Richard's personal assistant. Initially, Kaimara refuses, as she has no experience in the role. However, Mrs. Emo insists, warning her not to risk losing her job and persuades her to follow her. Meanwhile, Stephen sympathizes with Kaimara and shares his displeasure with Janny regarding Mrs. Emo's decision. He finds it unfair that despite Kaimara owing the company money, she was given a position that doesn't guarantee her job security. The two discuss this briefly before resuming their work. Kaimara approaches her new boss, Richard, and introduces herself as his personal assistant after he rudely calls her names. Richard is surprised to see a new PA and immediately begins teasing her, doubting she will last long in the role. He then orders her to get him coffee, but gives no specific instructions. When she returns with the coffee, he rejects it, behaving harshly and meanly toward her. Determined to do her job, Kaimara prepares another coffee and then returns to her workstation. Shortly after, Richard threatens to fire Kaimara for not knowing his schedule and storms out. Frustrated, she searches for Mrs. Emo to plead her case and express why she doesn't want the job. However, Mrs. Emo reveals that Kaimara's new salary is 3 times her current pay and insists that she is the only person with the resilience to last in the role. She then shows Kaimara where to find Richard's schedule. Meanwhile, Stephen and Janny overhear parts of the conversation and joke about it. Later, Mrs. Mba visits the office. When Kaimara introduces herself, Mrs. Mba sternly warns her that if she fails to perform well, she won't just be fired, she will also have to pay compensation. This puts immense pressure on Kaimara, making her situation even more challenging. That same day, while at work, Kaimara enters Richard's office and takes away the alcohol he is drinking, replacing it with something better to help him focus. However, Richard refuses to take her seriously and instead flirts with her. Unimpressed by his behavior, Kaimara rudely leaves his office. Angered by her reaction, Richard fires her on the spot. When their colleagues hear about Richard firing Kaimara, they are deeply disappointed. They express their frustration, knowing that the decision won't only affect Kaimara, but also Mrs. Emo. Though they find the situation painful, they continue with their work. Despite being fired, Kaimara later returns to the office and finds Richard fast asleep. She takes some documents and begins working on them. While reviewing the files, she suddenly screams in excitement. She has just secured a deal worth millions for the company. Rushing into Richard's office, she wakes him up and insists he sign the contract. However, Richard becomes furious because she acted without his permission. Out of anger, he tells her to drop the document and leave his office, which she does. Shortly after, he leaves without informing her of his destination, even when she asks. As Kaimara tidies Richard's office, his mother arrives and asks about his whereabouts. Since Kaimara has no idea, Mrs. Mba reprimands her, expressing her dislike for excuses. She warns Kaimara that if she fails to track Richard's movements during working hours, even if it means following him, she will be fired. Mrs. Mba then leaves, leaving Kaimara in shock. That night, Richard returns home drunk with 2 unknown women. They help him to his room as Dora, the maid, watches in surprise. One of the women later comes downstairs and rudely orders Dora to clean up the mess and prepare food for Richard. Moments later, Mrs. Mba arrives and asks Dora about her son. When Dora informs her that he is upstairs with the 2 women, Mrs. Mba rushes to his room. She finds the women attempting to take compromising pictures of Richard while he is asleep. Furious, she grabs their phones, deletes the pictures, and throws them out. When the women demand money, she refuses and chases them away. She then expresses her disappointment in her son and immediately calls Jani, urging her to come over. Meanwhile, Kaimara arrives home and shares her frustrations with her friend about how exhausting it is to work for Richard. She complains about his bad attitude, as well as his mother's overbearing nature. Though the job is unpleasant, Kaimara cannot resign because she owes the company $2.5 million. With her new salary of $900,000, she feels somewhat motivated to continue, but she still insists the amount is too small for her troubles. She and her friend then engage in a lighthearted conversation as they enjoy their time together. Later that night, Jani visits Mrs. Mba, who downplays Jani's concerns about Richard's infidelity. Instead, Mrs. Mba instructs her to set a wedding date with Richard once he wakes up. Despite her reluctance, Jani feels pressured to obey her future mother-in-law's manipulative words. After their conversation, Mrs. Mba leaves. When Richard finally wakes up, he and Jani discuss their engagement, but the conversation does not go well. Frustrated by his unreasonable behavior, Jani leaves without setting a wedding date. Later, Richard meets with his mother, making it clear that he does not want to marry Jani because he finds her lazy. However, Mrs. Mba dismisses his concerns, arguing that they can always hire as many maids as they want. She insists that since he refuses to change, marriage will force him to become more responsible. Still, Richard stands his ground, refusing to get married, and walks out on his mother. The next day, while Kaimara was busy with work at the office, Mrs. Mba came in and started accusing her of being responsible for her son's bad behavior. Kaimara apologized, after which Mrs. Mba handed her Richard's schedule for the day and instructed her to ensure that everything was completed. She also warned Kaimara to keep Richard out of trouble while he was in her care, then left. Frustrated, Kaimara expressed her distress. In Richard's office, Kaimara shared with Mrs. Emo what Mrs. Mba had said about her son. Mrs. Emo encouraged her and confided in her about the threat Mrs. Mba had made regarding the consequences if Richard fired her. Feeling sympathy for Mrs. Emo, Kaimara asked for Mrs. Mba's home address. That day, Kaimara went to Richard's house and introduced herself to the maid, Dora. She asked Dora to call Richard, but Dora refused. When Kaimara tried calling his number, which wasn't going through, she insisted on being led to his room, warning Dora that she might get punished if she didn't comply. Reluctantly, Dora allowed her in. Richard permitted Kaimara to enter, and she explained to him the tasks he needed to complete for the day, emphasizing that her job was at stake. However, he showed no interest and told her to leave. Instead of leaving empty-handed, Kaimara took his phone and bag and locked him in his room before instructing Dora to prepare breakfast. When Dora finished, Kaimara gave her the keys and ran off before she could be caught. Richard eventually came downstairs, demanding breakfast, but Kaimara insisted they leave for his meetings as his mother had instructed. Stubbornly, Richard refused to listen. When he attempted to call someone and drive off in his car, he discovered that Kaimara had taken his phone and car keys. Left with no other choice, he finally agreed to go along with her. Dora was stunned, as it was rare to see anyone control Richard the way Kaimara did. Honestly, Richard is not a good person. Why would a young man behave this way despite his wealth? What do you guys think? How would you handle a boss like Richard if you were his staff? Share your thoughts as we wait to see whether Kaimara will lose her job or not. Richard later reported to his mother, complaining about how badly Kaimara had treated him and demanding that she be fired. Mrs. Mba called Kaimara to explain herself. Using Mrs. Mba's own words as justification, Kaimara defended her actions. Mrs. Mba dismissed her but told Richard that she wouldn't fire Kaimara unless she had a valid reason. She then comforted her son with sweet words, and they spent time together. That same day, Kaimara prepared a document for Richard to review, but he kept frustrating her by making her redo the same task repeatedly. When she returned for the 5th time with the same document, Richard still refused to sign it, demanding she start over again. This time, Kaimara refused, raising her voice and insisting that she wouldn't redo it. She pointed out that she was essentially doing his job for him and that while he could not fire her, she would submit the document without his signature. Realizing she wouldn't budge, Richard finally signed the document and Kaimara left. What kind of boss does that? Do you think Kaimara is handling the situation correctly? Well, let's see how things unfold. The next morning, while Mrs. Mba was having coffee at the dining table, she checked her phone and saw that her son had gone to a club. She immediately called Dora to check whether Richard was home, but he wasn't. Dora confirmed this, and just then, Mrs. Mba received another call requiring her immediate attention, so she hurried out. Later, Mrs. Mba returned home with Richard and scolded him for getting into a fight at the club. However, he showed no remorse. Ignoring her, he called Dora and instructed her to prepare something for him to eat before walking off to his room, leaving Dora confused. Frustrated, Mrs. Mba called Jani, insulted her, and blamed her for what had happened to Richard. The following day, while Kaimara was working at Richard's house, he told her to prepare fresh food for him. She initially refused, but after he warned her about the consequences, she reluctantly agreed. After numerous complaints from Richard, she finally made the fried rice, chicken, and salad he had requested. However, after tasting it, he criticized the food and threatened to make her cook another meal if she misbehaved. He then ordered her out of his house, instructing her to complete her work before 4 p.m. because he was going out. He didn't care how she got things done and advised her to quit if she wasn't happy. But she knew she couldn't. That evening, Kaimara returned home, where her friend was still searching for job openings for her in case she got fired. However, Kaimara reassured her friend that Richard couldn't fire her. Instead, he wanted her to quit voluntarily or manipulate his mother into firing her, but she refused to give in. As they enjoyed their time together, Mrs. Mba called Kaimara and warned her that she would be held responsible if anything happened to Richard because she left work early. Concerned, Kaimara tried calling Dora to find out what was happening, but she couldn't reach her. Meanwhile, Richard was hosting a party at his house, inviting numerous women and enjoying himself. Suddenly, Jani arrived and was publicly embarrassed. Overcome with anger and pain, she attacked Richard, tired of his constant disrespect and games. Kaimara intervened, saving him from Jani's wrath. Furious, Jani chased everyone out of the house, expressing her deep hurt before leaving. Kaimara then helped Richard to his room since he was drunk. Later that day, Mrs. Mba returned home and immediately called Jani, slapping her for laying hands on Richard. She ignored all of Jani's accusations about Richard's behavior and instead blamed her for everything that had happened. Kaimara then explained to Mrs. Mba what had transpired and why she had left early, but instead of listening, Mrs. Mba slapped her as well. Angered, Kaimara finally spoke up, making Mrs. Mba realize how she was slowly ruining her son's life. Mrs. Mba tried to slap her again, but Kaimara stopped her, continuing to tell her the harsh truth, that she had failed as a mother and was a disgrace to motherhood. She then turned to Richard, making him see how worthless he was becoming. Lastly, she spoke to Jani, opening her eyes to the fact that she was wasting her time and value on a man who refused to take responsibility. After delivering these hard-hitting truths, Kaimara quit her job and walked out immediately. Upon returning home, she told her friend that she had resigned. She then went straight to her room, unwilling to discuss the matter further. She also decided to give an excuse for not reporting to work the next day, as her friend followed her into the room. Meanwhile, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Kaimara's words. They kept replaying in his mind, forcing him to reflect on himself. His mother noticed his distraction and called his attention, assuring him that she would deal with Kaimara. She also claimed that Jani would eventually apologize to him. However, Jani, having finally seen the truth, packed her belongings and left for good. Despite this, Mrs. Mba continued to assure her son that she would make everyone, especially Kaimara, pay for the humiliation. Surprisingly, Richard started defending Kaimara, but his mother remained firm in her plans for revenge. That night, Richard wondered why Kaimara had quit her job, especially after she had said she wouldn't. The next day, Richard woke up early and got ready for work. Before leaving, he instructed Dora to prepare breakfast and give it to his mother when she woke up. Dora was surprised and curious about what was going on. At the office, Mrs. Mba was shocked to see her son working. She checked on him to see if everything was all right, then gave him his food and left. Meanwhile, Kaimara, who was still asleep, woke up to Richard's call. He wanted her to return to work, despite knowing that his mother had fired her. Surprised, she told her friend, then got ready and left for the office. Later that day, Richard had a meeting with Kaimara, during which she explained why she couldn't quit her job. It was because of the large amount of money she owed the company. Richard acknowledged the hard work she had been putting in over the past week and opened up about his mother. He admitted that she always blamed others for his misbehavior and shared how his father always had to agree with her. Richard told Kaimara that he wanted to change and become a better person. Encouraged by her, he pleaded with her to remain his PA, and they got to work immediately. Richard then instructed Mrs. Emo to send messages to the staff he had previously fired, either rehiring them or helping them secure jobs elsewhere. Mrs. Emo was surprised by this sudden change, but did as he asked. Miss Mba soon arrived at the office and demanded that Kaimara leave, but Richard defended her. He had a meeting with his mother, during which he questioned her actions. With Kaimara's support, he explained that she had played a major role in his transformation and that he wanted her to remain as his PA. He firmly told his mother to let him take responsibility for his life and decisions. When she refused to listen, he excused her from his office. Later, Kaimara went home and confirmed to her friend that the dismissed staff had received compensation. She insisted on resuming work the following week, and they both enjoyed their time together. That weekend, Richard and Kaimara began to bond even more. He asked her about her mother and family, which surprised her. He then mentioned an upcoming exam he needed to take and requested her assistance at the office. After their conversation, they went their separate ways. When Richard returned home that day, he was annoyed by his mother's disapproval of his decision to drop his PA off. However, he had already made up his mind to take control of his life. He appreciated Kaimara for opening his eyes and helping him see things differently. One day, Richard visited Kaimara and shared some good news with her. He thanked her for everything she had done for him and his mother, and then informed her that she had been promoted to head of the marketing department. Overjoyed, Kaimara celebrated the achievement. Richard then asked her out on a date, but she told him she would think about it. Although she had feelings for him and knew him well, she still wasn't sure. Kaimara later shared the news with her friend, who had already suspected what was going on between them. Her friend encouraged her to accept Richard's invitation, but Kaimara remained uncertain. Despite this, they enjoyed their time together in excitement. On a special day, Richard, his mother, and the entire office staff threw a surprise birthday party for Kaimara. During the celebration, Richard took the opportunity to propose to her, and she said yes. It was a remarkable moment filled with love and joy, as both families and office staff celebrated together. This movie teaches us the value of patience when dealing with people. It also highlights the importance of taking responsibility for our lives. Additionally, it reminds parents to love their children, but not spoil them to the point of enabling irresponsible behavior. Finally, it encourages us to accept the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting updates on the latest Nigerian movies. See you next time.